Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where beauty, power, and intellect wove together into an unforgettable tapestry. Imagine the glittering streets of Paris in the 18th century, cobblestones slick with rain, gas lamps flickering softly in the dusk, and women with faces painted like porcelain dolls, draped in silk. But these women? They weren't just the it girls of their time. They were courtesans, the very heart of high society, with influence that reached far beyond the boudoir. You might think it sounds like a fantasy, a mix of intrigue, romance, and glittering wealth. But, let's face it, you probably wouldn't last a day in their world. The competition alone would have you running for cover, dressed in nothing but borrowed finery. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Always curious to see how far this journey travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. These courtesans weren't just glamorous companions to the wealthy. They were businesswomen, influencers, and sometimes even political powerhouses in their own right. Think of them as the 18th century equivalent of celebrities, charming, unpredictable, and at the very center of society's most lavish circles. But don't get too attached to that glittery image. Behind their beauty, they were often managing their own carefully orchestrated empires, with risks and rewards that would make your head spin. Let's start with the basics. What was a courtesan? Simply put, a courtesan was a woman who exchanged companionship, sometimes intimate, sometimes intellectual, for material wealth or social advantage. But what set them apart from ordinary women of the time was their unrivaled access to power. They mingled with French nobility, artists, intellectuals, and even royalty. In fact, the very name courtesan conjures up an image of luxury, fine gowns, extravagant hairstyles, sparkling jewels. But these women weren't born into aristocracy. Many were from humble beginnings, and they climbed their way up the social ladder by their wit, charm, and, often, their connections. Through savvy business deals and strategic alliances, they gained an enviable status. And while their lives were marked by wealth, they also came with great risk. Every courtesan had to balance her fame with constant competition, political manipulation, and the precariousness of love and loyalty. Historians still argue whether the courtesan's role was empowering or just another layer of exploitation. Were these women empowered, calling their own shots? Or were they simply playing a dangerous game in a patriarchal system? As we move forward in time, let's look at how these courtesans became icons of fashion, setting the trends that the rest of Paris would slavishly follow. Picture this: Paris, in the late 1700s. Every street corner was a stage, and courtesans were the star performers. Their appearances weren't just a showcase of beauty. They were political statements, art in motion, and subtle acts of rebellion all wrapped into one. Fashion during the 18th century wasn't merely about wearing the latest trends. It was about communicating power, social status, and sometimes even ideas. And the courtesans? They knew exactly how to use their clothing to their advantage. Wearing the finest silks, intricate lace, and towering wigs, they weren't just admired, they were worshipped. In a world where fashion was often an extension of one's wealth and influence, these women became the ultimate trendsetters. But here's the twist: courtesans didn't just copy what others wore. They made it their own. A madame, like Madame de Pompadour, one of the most famous courtesans of King Louis XV's court, didn't just wear fashion, she invented it. Pompadour was the one who made the panniers, those wide, side-swept skirts, fashionable. Her influence on French court fashion was so profound that it reshaped the way women dressed for an entire generation. Then there was the iconic hairstyle, the towering, powdered wigs that almost defied gravity. Women of high society scrambled to copy these styles, but no one could quite master the art of wig-wearing like a courtesan. Historians still argue whether these extravagant styles were a form of feminine empowerment or just a reflection of the ridiculous standards of beauty set by men. Either way, it was a game of appearance over substance, and the courtesans were the undisputed champions. The real kicker? These women didn't stop with fashion. They transformed Parisian beauty rituals, influencing perfume trends and the very art of seduction. Courtesans were often the first to popularize scents, wearing perfumes that were so rich and distinctive that they became an essential part of their allure. Imagine stepping into a room and being enveloped by the most intoxicating fragrance you could ever imagine, a scent that spoke of mystery, power, and sophistication. That's how courtesans work their magic. It wasn't just about looking beautiful. It was about creating an experience, a memory, a moment in time that couldn't be forgotten. It's no surprise that Paris became the undisputed fashion capital of the world, thanks to the courtesans who gave the city its flair. But as much as they set trends, they were also constantly fighting against the clock. Fashion may have been their power, but it was also their enemy. Fashion moved fast, and just like a fleeting trend, they had to keep reinventing themselves to stay at the top. This is where things get interesting, because as we'll see, not every courtesan was prepared for what came next. As we continue, it's time to dive into one of the most fascinating and often misunderstood elements of the courtesan's life, their role in French society. These women were not mere mistresses. They were some of the most influential figures of their time, influencing everything from politics to art, even shaping the intellectual currents of the day. The image of the courtesan as a mere object of desire is, in many ways, a simplification of their true power. In fact, the courtesans of 18th century Paris were the heart of the social, cultural, and political life of the city. While men might have held the formal positions of power, kings, ministers, and military generals, the courtesans wielded a different kind of influence. Their role wasn't just about physical allure, but also about intellect, charm, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics. They often played the role of confidant to kings, philosophers, and artists. They were the gatekeepers to influence, holding court in salons where nothing less than the future of France was discussed. Take, for example, Madame de Pompadour again. Beyond her relationship with King Louis XV, she was a cultural powerhouse. She was an avid patron of the arts, commissioning works from the likes of François Boucher and supporting the development of French porcelain. Historians still argue whether she used her position to further her personal ambitions or whether she truly had a genuine love for the arts and intellectual thought. Either way, Pompadour's ability to shape not only the king's court, but also the direction of French culture was unprecedented for someone in her position. Yet, the courtesan's influence wasn't limited to the arts and high society. Their power reached into the political realm as well. These women understood that sex and intellect weren't mutually exclusive. They used their charm and insight to sway men of power, acting as unofficial advisors, sometimes even influencing policies. For example, some courtesans were said to have persuaded kings and ministers to enact laws in favor of their own interests. At times, they even acted as mediators between warring factions, using their relationships to broker peace or seal agreements. What's fascinating is how courtesans, in many cases, were the unofficial spies of their time. Being in the rooms where decisions were made meant they overheard conversations that could change the course of French history. In fact, some courtesans were said to have passed on sensitive information to rival factions, making them key players in the political landscape, despite being entirely outside of official power. Historians debate whether these women were truly effective in their political maneuvers, or if they were simply pawns in a much larger game. But one thing is clear, they were not just decorative figures. They were power brokers in a world where power was often defined by who you knew and who you could influence. As we move through the century, though, the courtesan's role would change. Despite their immense influence, their status was precarious. In the male-dominated world of the 18th century, they had to constantly prove their worth. Every misstep could lead to a fall from grace, and many courtesans learned this the hard way. But for now, let's stay with the powerful image of the courtesan at the center of it all, her ability to influence, to make waves in the salons of Paris, and to become a true force in the city's social fabric. Now, let's take a deeper dive into the hidden world of Parisian salons, the very places where courtesans truly flexed their intellectual muscles. If you thought that salons were just fancy dinner parties, think again. These gatherings were a heady mix of high society, political gossip, and intellectual discourse, almost like the think tanks of the 18th century. And who ruled these salons? The courtesans, of course. These salons were often hosted by women, and while they were considered the upper echelons of society, they weren't just places for idle chatter. They were where revolutionaries were born, where philosophers debated, and where monarchs could be critiqued, all while enjoying a glass of wine or two. It was here that courtesans like Madame de Stael, one of the more famous courtesans turned intellectuals, could make waves, not with their beauty, but with their sharp minds. They wielded influence over writers, politicians, and artists, all the while maintaining their charm and allure. It wasn't just about who you knew. It was about what you could contribute to these conversations. And, as you might guess, courtesans had plenty to say. In these salons, a courtesan was often a political and social connector. They were the ones who introduced people to each other, gave introductions to the movers and shakers of society, and navigated the often murky waters of gossip and backstabbing. They weren't just beautiful ornaments on the arm of rich men. They were orchestrators of the intellectual and political currents that flowed through Paris. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room surrounded by some of the sharpest minds of the era, listening to debates on everything from the nature of man to the role of monarchy. Now, throw in a few glasses of champagne and the intimate glow of candlelight, and you've got yourself a scene right out of a historical novel. But here's the twist. These salons weren't always harmonious. Though courtesans held power within them, they were also constantly navigating a web of rivalries. Every conversation could be a calculated move, every connection a game of strategy. A courtesan didn't just network. She played a dangerous game of diplomacy, leveraging her position for influence while maintaining her allure. Think about it. Each word she spoke, every laugh she shared, could either solidify her place at the top or send her spiraling out of favor. And with the rise of the French Revolution, even the salons couldn't escape the upheaval that was about to shake France to its core. Now, there's something even more fascinating about these salons. The way they blurred the lines between the personal and the political. Conversations in the salons weren't just about idle gossip or political intrigues. Courtesans often used these spaces to air their personal grievances, to express their frustrations with the men who controlled their lives, and, in some cases, to express their political ambitions. The salon was where a courtesan could be both the object of desire and the subject of intellectual conversation, a rare balance that many women of the era never had the privilege to experience. Historians still argue whether these salons were a true expression of female empowerment or just another stage in the ongoing exploitation of women in high society. On one hand, they offered a platform for courtesans to voice their opinions and influence the political landscape. On the other hand, they were often confined to playing a role that benefited the men around them. No matter where you land in this debate, it's clear that the salons were a crucial part of the courtesan's strategy for power. As we venture deeper into the life of a courtesan, we start to see that the price of luxury, beauty, and influence was often paid in more than just money. It was also paid in emotional and personal sacrifice. Behind the silks, perfumes, and endless parties, the lives of these women were anything but simple. It wasn't all champagne toasts and compliments. There was a constant balancing act between maintaining power and enduring the consequences of their very public lives. Let's be clear, courtesans were not necessarily pampered, free-spirited women who enjoyed unencumbered independence. In many ways, they were living on a razor's edge, always mindful of their positions and what might happen if their patrons or lovers grew tired of them. This precarious position was both their strength and their weakness. Yes, they had wealth, influence, and the admiration of the elite, but at any given moment, their fortunes could change. A courtesan might be cast aside for a younger, more fashionable model or, worse yet, fall out of favor in the political circles they relied upon for survival. Take the example of the famous courtesan, Ninon de L'Enclos. She was a true legend in her time, admired not just for her beauty but for her intelligence and wit. Yet even she had to grapple with the ups and downs of a courtesan's life. Ninon was well known for her long-lasting relationship with several powerful men. But, as with all courtesans, when those relationships ended, so did her financial security. Many courtesans relied on a single benefactor to provide for them. When a lover abandoned them or a patron grew disinterested, they found themselves struggling to maintain the lifestyle they had once known. It was a volatile existence, constantly shifting between wealth and poverty, freedom and confinement. To further complicate matters, courtesans were often viewed with a mix of fascination and contempt. They were admired for their beauty and wit, but also scorned for the very nature of their careers. In the eyes of many, they were little more than high-priced escorts, their worth defined by the men they associated with. It's a double-edged sword. While a courtesan enjoyed privileges few other women could dream of, she was always at the mercy of society's fickle standards. And if she grew too old or faded from fashion, her position could quickly become untenable. Historians still argue whether the courtesan's lifestyle was a form of independence or a kind of glorified survival strategy. On one hand, courtesans had more freedom than most women of the time. They had the ability to choose their lovers, to control their time, and to dictate their own terms of engagement with society's most powerful figures. On the other hand, their freedom was limited by the very nature of their existence. The same connections that gave them power also dictated their survival. And for many, that meant constantly seeking out new relationships to maintain their status. But there was a hidden cost, one not immediately visible to outsiders. For all their beauty and allure, courtesans had to deal with the emotional toll of their lives. The constant need to charm, to entertain, and to remain desirable could be exhausting. And then there was the heartbreak of fleeting relationships, when a lover would discard them or when the inevitable aging process would begin to erode the very thing that had made them valuable. A courtesan's worth, after all, was tied to her beauty, and that was a fleeting thing. These emotional sacrifices weren't unique to any one courtesan. They were part of the collective experience of women who lived in this world. For every courtesan who thrived, there were others who struggled, who became disillusioned with the life they had chosen, or, in some cases, had been forced into. Their lives, though filled with riches and power, were often shadowed by loneliness, heartbreak, and the constant reminder that their beauty was not meant to last forever. Now, as we peel back the layers of the courtesan's world, it's important to examine the role of these women in the broader context of 18th century French society, especially in relation to the evolving ideas of gender, power, and morality. The courtesan wasn't just a figure of fascination for her wealth or beauty. She was also a symbol of the blurred lines between the public and private, the personal and political, in a society where boundaries were often defined by class and status. In many ways, the courtesan represented the ideal and the contradiction of the Enlightenment period. While France was experiencing an intellectual revolution, new ideas about liberty, reason, and equality were bubbling to the surface. The courtesan embodied the tension between these ideals and the reality of social hierarchies. On one hand, she represented a woman who could navigate those rigid structures with ease, commanding power and wealth in a world where women were often expected to be silent, submissive, and passive. But, on the other hand, the courtesan also exposed the darker side of this period, the inherent contradictions in a society that preached freedom while simultaneously objectifying women. Now, consider the courtesan's relationship with the aristocracy, which was rapidly evolving during the period. The nobility was beginning to lose some of its influence with the rise of the bourgeoisie, an emerging middle class that was, to put it bluntly, tired of the decadence and excess of the old regime. The courtesans of this era were often caught in the middle of this shifting dynamic. They weren't quite old money, but they weren't exactly part of the rising middle class either. They existed in a strange limbo, admired by the aristocracy for their beauty and wit, yet often looked down upon by the bourgeoisie, who saw them as the embodiment of all that was wrong with the aristocratic world. This tension became even more pronounced with the French Revolution. As the revolutionaries rallied against the monarchy and the old social order, the courtesans, with their close ties to the aristocracy, found themselves on precarious ground. Their wealth and power, built on the backs of the old regime, made them prime targets for revolutionary fervor. Some courtesans, like many members of the nobility, were caught up in the violence of the revolution, forced to flee Paris or face the guillotine. But others, ever the opportunists, used the revolution to their advantage, aligning themselves with the new political order to ensure their survival. The role of courtesans during the revolution is one of those areas where historians still debate how much influence they truly had. Some argue that courtesans, ever adaptable, managed to thrive during this period of upheaval, using their charm to sway both royalists and revolutionaries alike. Others claimed that their status was too tied to the monarchy and the old guard for them to make any lasting impact on the new social order. What is clear, however, is that, much like their lives, their fate was not entirely in their own hands. For those courtesans who managed to survive the tumult of the revolution, their lives would forever be changed. The aristocratic world they had once inhabited was no more, and they would have to find new ways to survive in a society that was fundamentally different from the one they had known. But the courtesan's resilience, her ability to reinvent herself and adapt to shifting power structures, remains one of the most fascinating aspects of her legacy. It's a curious thing to think about, isn't it? That women, who were often excluded from formal politics, could still play such a significant role in shaping the political and cultural landscape. Historians still argue whether the courtesan's influence was truly empowering or if it was just another layer of exploitation disguised as freedom. But no matter where you stand in this debate, there's no denying that the courtesans of 18th century France were, in their own way, a reflection of the contradictions that defined the era itself: glamorous and tragic, empowered yet subjugated, living at the intersection of beauty, power, and vulnerability. As we move forward in the story, let's take a closer look at the nature of the courtesans' relationships, particularly with the men who funded their lavish lives. While it's easy to reduce these women to the role of mere lovers or companions, the reality was far more complex. These relationships were often as much about power and social positioning as they were about affection, perhaps even more so. For the men involved, a courtesan wasn't just a mistress or a distraction. She was a valuable asset in a society that ran on favors, influence, and status. In many cases, a wealthy noble or aristocrat would take a courtesan as a mistress, but that relationship wasn't based on romantic love in the way we might imagine today. Sure, there was often attraction, beauty, charm, wit, but these relationships were also strategic, much like any other political alliance of the time. A courtesan could provide her lover with access to a particular circle of influence, where she could sway decisions that benefited him or his career. In return, she received financial support, luxury, and security, though these benefits were always temporary. A powerful man might lavish gifts upon his courtesan one year, and then discard her the next when she fell out of favor. One of the most striking examples of this transactional nature was the relationship between Madame de Pompadour and King Louis XV. Pompadour wasn't just a mistress, she was a political partner and confidant. Historians still debate whether Louis XV genuinely loved Pompadour or if he merely saw her as a useful ally in maintaining control over his court. Regardless, Pompadour played a key role in French politics during her time with the king, influencing decisions on matters of art, culture, and even military affairs. She wasn't just a passive recipient of royal favor. She was an active participant in the governance of the kingdom. Yet, despite the courtesan's ability to influence powerful men, their position was always precarious. A courtesan's power was derived not from her own agency, but from the patronage of a man. And once that man's affection shifted, the courtesan's power would often dissipate. When we look at figures like Madame du Barry, another of Louis XV's mistresses, we see just how quickly things could change. Du Barry was a woman of humble origins who rose to prominence through her relationship with the king. But when Louis XV died, Du Barry's power evaporated almost overnight. She was exiled from Versailles, and her fortune vanished in the blink of an eye. It's interesting, isn't it? How these women could wield so much influence one moment and lose everything the next. Historians still argue whether the courtesan's reliance on powerful men was a form of agency, or if it was merely an extension of their subjugation. On one hand, they were able to leverage their relationships for personal gain, but on the other, their futures were tied to the whims of the men they associated with. But let's not be too quick to dismiss the courtesan's role in these relationships. After all, many courtesans were able to secure financial independence from their patrons, and some even made their own fortunes through savvy investments. A number of them managed to maintain their wealth and influence long after their relationships had ended. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, invested her own money in the French porcelain industry, building a fortune that lasted beyond her time at court. For some, the courtesan's life was one of reinvention, constantly changing the way she navigated relationships with powerful men. For others, it was a game of survival, an understanding that the power she held today could disappear tomorrow. But no matter the circumstances, the courtesan was always a player in a game that demanded adaptability, cunning, and above all, charm. What's also intriguing is the sheer number of courtesans who managed to remain relevant long after their initial rise to power. Some of them, like Madame de Pompadour, left a lasting mark on French culture. Others, like the infamous La Présidente de Beauharnais, secured a place in history not just as a mistress, but as a woman whose influence extended well into the political and social spheres of the time. These women didn't just fade into obscurity. They remained figures of importance, wielding power in a world that didn't often allow women to do so. Their stories raise an important question, one that historians still wrestle with. Can we view the courtesan as a symbol of feminine agency, or were they merely pawns in a world dominated by men? In many ways, they were both, empowered and constrained, powerful yet vulnerable. A courtesan's life was defined by her ability to navigate a world where women were given little power and even less autonomy. Yet they managed to play the game with grace, even when the odds were stacked against them. Now, let's take a closer look at the material world of the 18th century courtesan. It wasn't just about clever conversation and strategic alliances. It was also about the luxuries that came with the title, the decadent gowns, the exquisite jewelry, the endless supply of fine perfumes and silks. To be a courtesan in Paris meant living a life steeped in opulence, surrounded by the finest things money could buy. But, much like their relationships with men, this wealth was fragile, temporary, and, for many, a constant reminder of their tenuous position in society. Imagine yourself stepping into the lavish apartment of a Parisian courtesan. The room is illuminated by flickering candlelight, the air rich with the scent of rosewater and jasmine. The furniture is of the finest quality, with silken cushions piled high on velvet chairs. A large mirror reflects the glow of the room, while paintings from celebrated artists hang on the walls. There, draped across a chaise lounge, you would find the courtesan herself, dressed in the finest silks, her hair piled high with jewels, her face adorned with makeup that would make even the most skilled artist envious. This was a life of excess, but it wasn't one that was easily sustained. A courtesan's wardrobe alone was enough to leave one speechless. Elaborate gowns with intricate lacework, expensive furs, and gowns so delicate they had to be handled with the utmost care. Every detail of her appearance was crafted to perfection, for the courtesan's beauty was both a weapon and a currency. Historians often debate how much of a courtesan's wealth came from her own talents or from the lavish gifts of her patrons. But what we do know is that her appearance was a key element of her success. To be noticed, to be remembered, to be desired, it all relied on how well she presented herself to the world. But it wasn't just about the clothes. The courtesan's lifestyle extended to every aspect of her environment. The finest food, the most exquisite wines, and servants who attended to her every need. Think of the exotic fruits and dishes imported from the far reaches of the empire. Fresh oranges from the West Indies, rich pastries made with the finest sugar, the most luxurious teas from China. Each meal was an opportunity to impress, not just with flavor, but with the display of wealth and power. The courtesan wasn't merely living in luxury. She was flaunting it, ensuring that everyone who entered her space could see the wealth she commanded. Yet, for all the glamour, there was an underlying sense of impermanence. The courtesan knew that the riches she enjoyed could slip away at any moment. Her patrons might tire of her, the political tides might shift, or the next young beauty could come along and dethrone her. It's easy to look at these women and think of them as figures of endless indulgence. But behind the luxury, there was always the awareness that this world, this gilded cage, could come crashing down. It's worth noting that courtesans were not just dependent on the gifts of their patrons for luxury. They were also often astute investors in their own right. Some courtesans, like Madame de Pompadour, took their fortunes and used them to create lasting wealth that went beyond their relationships with men. Pompadour, for example, had an impressive collection of art and porcelain, items that would become not only symbols of her status, but investments that could be passed down through generations. These savvy investments allowed some women to outlast the fickle nature of their relationships and maintain their wealth long after their political connections had faded. Still, The majority of courtesans found their wealth and luxury tightly bound to the whims of their lovers and patrons. The moment those relationships ended, so did the income that funded their extravagant lives. The courtesan was walking a fine line between security and ruin, with little room for error. The question arises, how much agency did the courtesan truly have in managing her wealth? Was her lavish lifestyle a reflection of her own ambition, or was it merely the byproduct of a system that exploited her beauty and charm? Historians still argue over whether the courtesan's wealth should be seen as a sign of empowerment or as a form of commodification. On one hand, these women had access to wealth and luxury that few others could even imagine. On the other hand, that wealth was often derived from a transactional, exploitative system in which the courtesan was more often the object than the subject. For every Madame de Pompadour who managed to parlay her status into lasting wealth, there were many others who saw their fortunes vanish when their relationships did. In the end, the courtesan's material world, though stunning and lavish, was a double-edged sword. Her riches could be a form of power, but they also served as a constant reminder of how fragile her position really was. The courtesan lived in a world where beauty and wealth could provide comfort and security, but only for as long as the game lasted. As we venture deeper into the world of the 18th century courtesan, it becomes clear that their role wasn't just about personal wealth and political intrigue. The courtesan, in many ways, was a product of her environment, shaped by the culture and values of a rapidly changing society. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and individual liberty, had started to question the old systems of power and hierarchy, but at the same time, it was still a world where wealth, beauty, and charm could open doors that talent or merit could not. In fact, many of the courtesans of the time were known not just for their beauty, but for their intellect and conversation. These women were far from the vapid stereotypes we might imagine today. The courtesan was often well-read, witty, and capable of holding her own in the intellectual salons that were springing up in Paris. In the salons, philosophers, writers, and artists would gather to discuss the latest ideas, often radical ones about liberty, governance, and society. And it was here that the courtesan could find herself rubbing shoulders with some of the most prominent minds of the day. Take, for example, the famous courtesan and intellectual Madame de Staël. She was not only a lover of some of Europe's most powerful men, but also an influential writer and thinker. She participated in the intellectual debates of her time, contributing ideas that would shape the course of European history. Her salons were known as spaces for the exchange of ideas, where courtesans, philosophers, and politicians could gather and discuss everything from art to politics. Madame de Staël's influence was not just about the men she associated with, but also about the ideas she championed, which led her to become one of the most prominent intellectuals of her era. Yet, despite this intellectual engagement, there was always the underlying tension between the courtesan's personal power and the limitations imposed by society. Yes, she could charm a king, wield political influence, and engage in deep intellectual discussions. But her life was still, in many ways, dictated by the rules of the time. The rules that saw her, at best, as a prized possession and, at worst, a mere object. Her relationships with powerful men gave her access to intellectual and artistic circles, but it also placed her in a constant state of dependency. Historians still debate whether these women were true intellectuals in their own right, or whether they were simply opportunistic figures who used their beauty and charm to gain access to power. It's easy to see them as the latter, but the reality is more nuanced. Some courtesans, like Madame de Staël, used their position to influence the intellectual currents of their time. Others, while certainly savvy in matters of influence, were still playing a game where their value was tied to their beauty and allure. It's a curious contradiction. On the one hand, the courtesan could rise above the societal expectations of her gender and use her wit and charm to shape the course of history. On the other hand, she was always at risk of being reduced to the sum of her parts, her looks, her allure, and her connections. The courtesan's intellectual legacy, when examined, is often overshadowed by her role as a lover or companion. And yet, it is impossible to ignore the contributions these women made to the cultural fabric of the time. The role of the courtesan, at least from a historical standpoint, has been complicated by these contradictions. Were they truly empowered women who broke the mold of gender expectations, or were they merely pawns in a system that used their beauty and intelligence for political gain? Historians still argue over the answers, but one thing is clear. The courtesan was far more than just a passive figure. She was an active participant in the cultural and political life of 18th century France, using her charm, beauty, and intellect to navigate a world that sought to define her solely by her relationships with men. Yet, even as we celebrate their intellectual and social achievements, we must remember that their power was not absolute. Their futures were still at the mercy of the whims of their lovers, patrons, and society at large. A courtesan's influence might be long-lasting, but it was always vulnerable to the next shift in the political or social landscape. In many ways, this tension between intellectual and social influence and personal insecurity made the courtesan's world all the more fascinating. By now, we've seen that the courtesan's world was one of wealth, influence, and beauty, but also one of fragility. No matter how powerful or revered a courtesan was, her life was always subject to the shifting tides of political and social change. Yet, even amidst these uncertainties, the courtesan's role in French society remained a subject of fascination and speculation. This leads us to an even more intriguing aspect of their existence: the legacy they left behind. The courtesan's life was short-lived for many. The glamour, the beauty, and the wealth, they all had an expiration date. As we've seen, their relationships with powerful men were often fleeting, and once their time in the limelight faded, so did their status. For most, the end came suddenly. A young, rising beauty would quickly capture the attention of their patron, or the political winds would shift, rendering their place in the social hierarchy irrelevant. But despite this impermanence, many courtesans managed to leave behind a legacy far beyond their years in the courts of Versailles or Paris. One of the most fascinating aspects of their legacy was their influence on the arts. Courtesans were not only patrons of the arts, they were often the very subjects of art. Painters, sculptors, and poets regularly sought them out as models for their works, immortalizing their beauty in oils and marble. In many ways, the courtesan became a symbol of both the physical and intellectual allure of the Enlightenment era. The works of artists like François Boucher, Jean-Honoré Fragonard, and Elisabeth Louise V.G. Lebrun captured these women in their prime. Exquisite, untouchable, yet full of the complexities and contradictions that defined their lives. It's hard not to see how the courtesans, in their roles as muses and patrons, contributed to the cultural richness of the period. Through their relationships with artists, writers, and philosophers, they helped shape the aesthetic ideals of the time. Whether it was the soft sensuality depicted in Rococo art or the more intellectual portrayals of women in neoclassical works, the courtesan had a part to play in defining the visual language of an era. Even more than that, the courtesan's legacy was felt in the world of fashion. Fashion in 18th century France was as much a political statement as it was an expression of personal style. The courtesan was often at the forefront of this trend-setting. Designers and milliners would look to them for inspiration, and it was not unusual for an outfit worn by a popular courtesan to inspire an entire fashion movement. A courtesan's wardrobe could dictate the latest trends in Parisian society. One evening, she might wear a gown adorned with a particular type of lace, and before long, that lace would be the talk of the town. Yet, the courtesan's legacy was not solely defined by her beauty or her influence on the arts and fashion. It also extended to the social structures she helped to shape. While women of the time were generally confined to the domestic sphere or the courts of their husbands, the courtesan broke those boundaries. She was a woman who made her own choices, forged her own path, and in some cases, accumulated her own wealth. In a society where women were often defined by their relationships to men, the courtesan stood apart, commanding attention and respect in her own right. Historians still debate whether the courtesan's role was truly empowering or if she was simply exploiting the system to her own benefit. But, whether seen as a victim or a victor, she was undeniably a force in a time that otherwise tried to limit the power and agency of women. Perhaps what's most interesting about the courtesan's legacy is how it lives on in popular imagination. The image of the 18th century courtesan, opulent, powerful, yet fragile, is still with us today. In films, literature, and even modern-day fashion, the courtesan has been romanticized, turned into a figure of mystery, allure, and tragedy. Her story has been told and retold, often with a focus on her beauty and the dramatic twists and turns of her life. Yet, the courtesan was not merely a symbol of seduction. She was a product of a specific time and place, a woman navigating the complex realities of a society that was both glamorous and oppressive. Historians continue to debate the courtesan's true role in 18th century society. Was she a symbol of empowerment, a woman who played the game of power on her own terms? Or was she a victim of a system that reduced her to an object of desire and political leverage? What is clear, however, is that the courtesan's life was one of constant negotiation. Her beauty, intelligence, and charm gave her power, but that power was always at risk of being taken away, like a house of cards poised to collapse. Yet, in the grand scheme of history, the courtesan's legacy is far from insignificant. She left behind a cultural imprint that still resonates today, influencing the way we think about beauty, power, and gender. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most lasting mark of all, not the wealth she accumulated or the men who adored her, but the way in which she became a symbol of both the possibilities and limitations of women in a changing world. As we've seen, the courtesan's life was a delicate balance of power, beauty, and fragility. Yet, to truly understand their complex position in 18th century French society, we must turn to the fascinating and often shocking world of their relationships with men. While these women were far from being mere objects of desire, the dynamics of their partnerships reveal much about the intricate social and political networks that shaped their lives. The courtesan's relationships with powerful men were transactional, but they were also deeply personal in many ways, albeit often marked by manipulation, competition, and secrecy. Let's imagine, for a moment, what these relationships looked like. Picture yourself entering one of Paris's grand salons, perhaps late at night, where the air is thick with perfume and the clink of fine china. The courtesan, sitting in a corner with a slight smile, catches the eye of a man of great influence, maybe a duke, a financier, or even a high-ranking politician. In that moment, they are not just a woman of beauty, but a woman of power, holding the potential to influence the course of politics, culture, or even war. These men were not simply patrons in the traditional sense. They were often deeply entwined with the courtesan's personal and professional life. Historians still argue whether these relationships should be seen primarily as love affairs or as mere strategic partnerships. Were the courtesans using their charm to manipulate these men for their own purposes? Or were they, perhaps, truly in love, managing to form connections that transcended the transactional nature of their roles? One of the most famous courtesans to engage in this kind of complicated, intimate relationship was Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of King Louis XV. While Pompadour may have initially been viewed by many as just another beautiful woman with a royal lover, her true power came from her ability to manipulate the political landscape of France. Historians still debate the extent to which Pompadour's relationship with the king was driven by love or political strategy. What's undeniable is that she wielded tremendous influence in shaping the monarchy's policies, helping to select ministers, direct foreign policy, and even influence the arts. Her relationship with Louis XV wasn't just about affection. It was about securing her place in history and ensuring her ongoing political power. Yet, not all courtesans were so fortunate. For many, the relationship with their patrons was far more fleeting and often marked by ruthless competition. In this world, the courtesan wasn't just vying for the favor of a single man, but for the position of preeminent companion in a highly competitive market. The primary currency in these relationships wasn't just beauty. It was loyalty, wit, and the ability to offer something that no other courtesan could. These women were constantly aware of the fact that at any moment, their place could be usurped by another younger, more attractive, or more politically savvy rival. Take, for example, the case of one of the most famous courtesans of the time, La Pompadour's rival, Madame du Barry. Though she eventually rose to the position of Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry's path to power was less smooth than Pompadour's. She was often seen as a newcomer in a world that was governed by established social rules and relationships. She had no noble lineage to speak of, and her rise to prominence came at the expense of other women who had spent years in the courts of Versailles. It's said that her competitors resorted to all manner of tactics to undermine her, spreading rumors, sabotaging her attempts at social climbing, and even plotting behind her back. In this cutthroat world, the courtesan was more than just a lover. She was a rival in a game where beauty and power were the ultimate prizes. The competition among courtesans was not just about their looks or charm. It was also about who could best provide for the emotional needs of their patrons. For many powerful men, the courtesans served as a kind of escape from the rigid constraints of their marriages and royal duties. The courtesan's role, therefore, was not just to entertain but to soothe, to offer a sympathetic ear, to provide comfort and diversion when life became too taxing. The relationship was often a form of escape, and in this way, the courtesan also had a role to play in maintaining the mental and emotional health of these men. Historians still argue whether these relationships were more emotionally fulfilling than we imagine. Could these men, for all their wealth and power, truly be in love with their courtesans? Was there something deeper there, beyond the mere transactional nature of their interactions? Some say that these men sought out courtesans because they offered something that their wives, often bound by duty and social obligation, could not: freedom. The courtesan's world was one of unencumbered passion, intellectual stimulation, and personal attention, qualities that could be difficult to find in the world of royal marriages. But of course, this dynamic wasn't just about the men. The courtesans, in their way, were equally invested in the relationships. Whether driven by a desire for power, status, or emotional fulfillment, they knew how to play the game, and play it well. They had to be astute, understanding the nuances of their lovers' desires and needs, while also staying one step ahead of the competition. A courtesan's ability to remain in favor wasn't simply a matter of beauty. It was about knowing how to maintain a delicate balance between affection and ambition. So, while historians may continue to debate the nature of these relationships, one thing is clear: they were an essential part of the courtesan's world. A courtesan's survival and success depended not just on the gifts she received, but on her ability to navigate the labyrinth of male desire, political power, and personal ambition. In the end, these relationships were often the defining feature of her existence, relationships that were as fragile, complex, and fleeting as the courtesan herself. Having explored the courtesan's relationships with powerful men, it's now time to shift our focus toward the social context that made these women not only viable, but also indispensable in the 18th century French aristocratic world. To truly understand the courtesan's influence, we must consider the strict and often absurd social norms that governed French society at the time. The aristocracy, with its extravagant tastes and highly regulated behaviors, was a strange mix of intellectual pursuits and rigid propriety. In this environment, courtesans found a peculiar, yet powerful, niche. The French court, particularly under King Louis XIV and his successor, Louis XV, was a world of complex rituals, manners, and etiquette. Every gesture, from the way a nobleman bowed to how a woman sipped her tea, was governed by rules. It was a society obsessed with appearances, where the line between true nobility and mere wealth was drawn by bloodlines and titles, factors that often excluded the courtesan from being considered true members of high society. Yet, despite their lack of noble birth, courtesans were able to infiltrate this world, becoming indispensable figures to both the nobility and the monarchy itself. At the heart of this world were the salons, gatherings of the intellectual elite where great minds met to discuss philosophy, politics, and art. These salons were hosted by the very women who, to society's eye, were little more than mistresses or companions to men of power. The paradox here is striking. In a world where women were often relegated to the private sphere, the courtesan managed to carve out a space in the most public and intellectual realms of the time. The courtesan's position in these salons was often precarious. She could be regarded as an intellectual equal in the same breath as she was considered an object of desire. It was a double-edged sword. If she was too learned, she could be accused of being too masculine in her demeanor and ideas, pushing her further outside the accepted feminine role. On the other hand, if she was not seen as sufficiently intellectual, she risked being dismissed as nothing more than a pretty face. Despite these challenges, Many courtesans were able to use their position in these intellectual circles to their advantage. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, was not just a lover of Louis XV, but a true patron of the arts and sciences. She helped fund the production of encyclopedias, supported the work of the philosopher Voltaire, and played a crucial role in advancing the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. This was a woman who was able to marry beauty with brains and use her position as a courtesan to not only influence the monarchy, but to shape the intellectual discourse of the time. Historians still debate whether these intellectual pursuits were a mere facade, a way to justify the courtesan's position within these elite circles, or whether they were, in fact, genuine contributions to the cultural and intellectual life of France. Could a woman, whose primary role in society was considered to be a lover, a muse, or a companion, truly contribute to the intellectual development of an entire nation? Was it possible that the courtesan, despite her compromised position, was able to be both an object of desire and a contributor to France's philosophical and artistic legacy? Some historians argue that courtesans like Madame de Pompadour were among the most influential figures in 18th century France precisely because they bridged the gap between the worlds of high politics and high culture. They moved between the private sphere of intimate relationships and the public sphere of salons and royal courtrooms, playing a crucial role in the social fabric of the time. As women who didn't fit neatly into the expected roles of wife and mother, they were free to form relationships with influential men and wield their own form of power. Yet, this influence wasn't without its limits. For all their intellectual engagement, courtesans still had to navigate a world that was dominated by men and ruled by patriarchal values. Their status, however high, was always precarious. They were never quite able to escape the specter of their beauty, always being judged, in part, for how they looked and how they captivated those around them. A courtesan's influence was only as long-lasting as her youth and beauty, and once those faded, so too did her power. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? The courtesan could contribute to philosophy and art, could help shape the cultural and intellectual life of her time, but she could never escape the fact that her ultimate value was often tied to her appearance. The physical beauty that made her so powerful was also her eventual downfall. This contradiction lies at the heart of the courtesan's existence. She was both celebrated and limited by her beauty. Historians still argue whether the courtesan's intellectual contributions should be taken seriously or whether they were simply the result of a more elaborate performance. After all, it was easy for the courtesan to be written off as a mere ornament of the aristocracy, a distraction from the truly serious work being done by men. But could that be an unfair judgment? Is it possible that these women, given their unique position in society, were able to influence the course of history in ways we've overlooked? The courtesan's world was one of complex negotiation between intellect and appearance, between love and power, between the private and the public. In many ways, their intellectual and social legacy is still with us today, though it's often overlooked in favor of their more scandalous roles as lovers or mistresses. Still, it's undeniable that these women played a crucial part in the shaping of the French Enlightenment and in the broader cultural shifts of the 18th century. Now that we've examined the courtesans' intellectual contributions and their place within the salons of the French elite, we can shift gears slightly to explore an equally intriguing aspect of their existence: the fascinating, and often downright bizarre, world of their day-to-day routines. On the surface, their lives may have seemed opulent and glamorous, full of fine clothes, lavish feasts, and intimate relationships with powerful men. However, behind the velvet curtains of their luxurious apartments, the courtesans' daily lives were dictated by a rigorous, sometimes eccentric, set of rituals. For the courtesan, every day began with a series of careful preparations as they navigated the delicate balance of beauty, charm, and social standing. It's said that no detail of their appearance was ever overlooked. Much like an actor preparing for a role, the courtesan's daily routine was an elaborate performance designed to ensure that she remained at the height of her allure. From the moment she woke, her beauty and charm had to be meticulously maintained. Imagine for a moment what that would have been like. The early morning hours were often spent in the careful art of makeup, dressing, and hairstyling, processes that could take hours. The courtesans of the time often wore complex, powdered wigs that required constant attention, and their elaborate gowns were carefully chosen to convey not just wealth, but status. Women of the highest rank could often be found covered in layers of silk, lace, and embroidery, sometimes weighing as much as 15 pounds. But it wasn't just about the clothes. The courtesan also had to manage her image, perhaps more so than any other member of society. To keep her position at the court, she had to appear effortlessly elegant at all times. Fashion was a powerful weapon in her arsenal. A courtesan's ability to influence others often came down to what she wore, how she wore it, and when she wore it. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? How much of a woman's power in 18th century France could be determined by something as simple as a dress or a ribbon in her hair. Historians still argue whether the courtesans were ever truly able to own their beauty or whether it was always, in some ways, a social currency that they were constantly exchanging. Was the effort they put into maintaining this appearance empowering, or was it merely a form of self-imposed enslavement to a system that demanded their perfection? While beauty undoubtedly gave them power, that same beauty was often their greatest vulnerability. Beyond the physical upkeep, the courtesan's day was also filled with a series of carefully orchestrated social engagements. As a member of the French court, a courtesan had to attend regular gatherings, dinners, balls, and other high society events that were essential to maintaining her social standing. These events were often marked by a delicate game of status, in which the courtesan had to remain poised and charming at all times. The idea was simple. The more attention she received, the more desirable and influential she became. But it wasn't all about the spotlight. It was about control. A courtesan's true skill was in knowing how to maneuver within the social web of the aristocracy, always ensuring that she was in the right place at the right time, conversing with the right people. Yet, despite all the socializing, much of the courtesan's life was spent in relative isolation. The constant public attention was exhausting, and when the social events of the day wound down, the courtesan often retreated to the private space of her chambers. There, she could be alone, or at least as alone as one could be in a society where privacy was often a luxury. It was during these moments of solitude that the courtesan might reflect on her position in life, strategize for the future, or simply rest after a day filled with relentless performance. But solitude didn't necessarily mean rest. Many courtesans were also involved in the management of their personal finances, which often involved keeping track of multiple patrons and their payments. While courtesans may have been skilled in matters of love and seduction, they were often just as adept in business. Some courtesans were known to have amassed substantial fortunes, carefully managing estates, art collections, and even investments. In fact, it's often said that many of the wealthiest courtesans were far more savvy with money than their aristocratic counterparts, who were often more concerned with gambling and extravagant expenditures than with practical financial planning. This financial acumen was one of the courtesans' most important tools. With the uncertainty of their position in society, a courtesan needed to ensure that her wealth was carefully protected. Patronage was fickle. What was granted one day could be withdrawn the next. Therefore, many courtesans took it upon themselves to safeguard their futures by investing wisely and accumulating assets. In many ways, the courtesan's ability to adapt to the volatile economic and political climate was one of her defining traits. Despite their apparent financial success, many courtesans were aware that their wealth and status were tenuous. Once they had outlived their usefulness or their beauty had faded, they could quickly find themselves discarded by the men who once adored them. As such, many courtesans were also careful to create lasting legacies, often through patronage or by helping their children, if they had any, gain a place in the world. Their children, especially if born of a wealthy patron, were sometimes able to inherit their mother's wealth or, in rare cases, her status. The courtesan, in this way, was both a product and a creator of the society in which she lived, balancing the demands of personal survival with the desire to leave behind something that could endure beyond her. Historians still argue whether this practical aspect of a courtesan's life diminishes the romantic allure that we so often associate with them. Does the knowledge that these women were managing their own fortunes and futures take away from their image as delicate, ethereal beauties, or does it add a layer of intrigue to their stories? Were these women simply surviving, or were they shaping the course of their own destinies? As we reflect on the daily life of the courtesan, it becomes clear that hers was a life defined by discipline, strategy, and constant reinvention. Behind the layers of lace and silk, beneath the powdered wigs and painted faces, there was a woman constantly navigating the treacherous waters of power, beauty, and survival. And yet, for all the effort, for all the ritual, the question remains, was it worth it? Now that we've explored the courtesan's day-to-day life, complete with its routines, rituals, and constant performance, it's time to address one of the most poignant aspects of their existence: the eventual decline of their power and beauty. As much as these women were revered for their ability to captivate, their stories were often marked by a bittersweet inevitability: the fading of youth and the loss of their place in the royal courts. The courtesan's decline was often a delicate and sometimes tragic affair, a reflection of both the fleeting nature of beauty and the fragile position these women held in a society that valued them based on how they looked, not who they were. Imagine for a moment, as the courtesan reaches her mid-30s, the once sought-after beauty that captivated men's hearts starts to fade. The powdered wigs are replaced with more subtle hairstyles, the gowns become less extravagant, and the eyes that once sparkled with youthful allure no longer have the same effect. The courtesan, whose entire life was built on the foundation of her appearance, now finds herself at a crossroads. The attention she once commanded begins to wane, and with it, her place in the social world she's fought so hard to maintain. Historians still debate what the real consequences were for courtesans once their beauty had faded. Was their decline simply a matter of time, or was it a result of changing fashions and shifting political tides? Some argue that, while the courtesan's power was always contingent on her looks, she could sometimes maintain influence through wit, intellect, or strategic alliances. Others, however, contend that there was no way to escape the inevitable. Once the courtesan could no longer attract the attention of powerful men, her world began to shrink. For some women, the end came slowly. A courtesan could remain in the court for years, even after she was no longer the center of attention. She might continue to be involved in courtly activities or act as a kind of advisor or confidant. However, the social world of Versailles and Paris was not kind to those whose beauty had waned. New, younger courtesans were constantly rising to take their place, and the old guard was often left to watch their power erode with painful slowness. The most tragic stories, however, were those of women who faced sudden obsolescence. These women, often older or without the means to reinvent themselves, found themselves cast aside, sometimes without any warning. A woman like Madame du Barry, who had once been the favorite of Louis XV, would find herself abandoned by the king once the royal court's attention shifted elsewhere. For some courtesans, the end of their reigns was marked by financial ruin, public disgrace, or even quiet exile from the courts they had once dominated. The once wealthy women, whose lives were built on relationships with powerful men, often found themselves destitute when these men moved on or when the political climate changed. A particularly striking example of this decline can be found in the story of the infamous courtesan, Sophie Arnold. Once the queen of Parisian salons, Sophie's beauty and voice were celebrated throughout France. As a famous opera singer and lover of influential men, she was the epitome of 18th-century allure. However, as she aged, her beauty began to fade, and with it, her influence. Though she tried to reinvent herself in her later years, Sophie's decline was as public as her rise. Historians still argue whether her eventual obscurity was due to her inability to adapt to the changing world of 18th-century French society, or whether it was a reflection of the fleeting nature of fame itself. There were, of course, those who found ways to survive after their beauty had faded. Some courtesans transitioned into more discreet, quieter lives, using the wealth they had accumulated to live in comfort. Others found new roles within society, whether as patronesses of the arts, philanthropists, or even writers. Some courtesans, like Madame de Pompadour, were able to maintain their influence despite the passage of time. Pompadour, though no longer the king's mistress by the time of her death, remained a fixture in French cultural life, a testament to the power that courtesans could wield beyond their physical allure. For Pompadour and others like her, it was intellectual engagement and political savvy that ensured their legacy. The debate over how long a courtesan could maintain her power once her beauty had faded is still a point of scholarly discussion. Was beauty truly the only factor that dictated a courtesan's place in society, or could charm, intelligence, and political connections prolong a courtesan's reign? Some historians suggest that, for a time, a woman's ability to adapt was key to her survival. After all, the 18th century was also the age of the Enlightenment, a time when intellectual and artistic contributions were beginning to be celebrated in ways that were less tied to outward appearance. Yet, for many, the decline was inevitable. As much as the courtesan could command the attention of kings and aristocrats in her youth, her beauty and allure would eventually fade. The courtesan's power was always rooted in her ability to stay relevant, to remain a symbol of what was desirable in a rapidly changing society. When the attention of the aristocracy moved on to younger, fresher faces, the courtesan's time had passed. So, what does this mean for the courtesan's legacy? Historians still argue whether the life of the courtesan should be remembered as one of fleeting glamour, or whether we should recognize the complex, often painful realities of their lives. Were they simply victims of a superficial society, or did they play an active role in shaping their destinies, leveraging beauty for power in ways that few women of their time could? The courtesan's story is ultimately one of paradoxes: power and vulnerability, beauty and decay, intellectual achievement and societal marginalization. The end of a courtesan's reign, whether slow and dignified or swift and humiliating, serves as a sobering reminder of the transience of fame, beauty, and influence in the courtly world of 18th century France. As we near the end of our exploration of the secret lives of 18th century courtesans, it's essential to reflect on the lasting impact these women left behind, both on their contemporaries and on the broader course of history. Although their power and beauty were often fleeting, the legacy of the courtesan continues to intrigue us today. They were not merely ornamental figures in the courts of kings and nobles. They were women who navigated a complex world of politics, art, and culture, often leaving a mark far deeper than we might expect. One of the most enduring legacies of the courtesan is their role in shaping the cultural and intellectual atmosphere of their time. From the salons to the royal court, they were present at the heart of Enlightenment-era France, where they participated in the same philosophical and artistic debates that defined the period. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, was more than just a lover to Louis XV. She was a patron of the arts and a significant influence on the intellectual life of the time. She helped to fund and promote the work of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and supported the creation of important cultural institutions, including the Sèvres porcelain factory. Despite being considered a mere mistress by many, Pompadour's intellectual influence can still be felt today. Similarly, courtesans like Ninon de L'Enclos and Madame de Maintenon were able to use their relationships with powerful men to forge meaningful connections within intellectual circles, becoming symbols of the intersection between beauty, power, and knowledge. They didn't just entertain, they engaged with the artists, writers, and philosophers of their time, and their conversations contributed to the cultural ferment of the 18th century. Historians still debate the extent to which these courtesans should be remembered for their intellectual and cultural contributions. Were they truly shaping the course of history, or were they simply exploiting the opportunities afforded to them by their beauty? Some scholars argue that we must separate the courtesan's intellectual legacy from her role as a mistress, while others suggest that the two are inextricably linked. After all, the courtesan's position allowed her to influence men of power in ways that few women could, and through these relationships, she was able to leave an indelible mark on the world of ideas. Beyond their intellectual contributions, the courtesan also left a lasting imprint on the art and fashion of the time. As we discussed earlier, their wardrobes were a spectacle in themselves: elaborate gowns, wigs, and accessories that set the trends for the aristocracy. But their fashion influence extended beyond the clothes they wore. The courtesan's ability to manipulate her image, carefully curating her public persona, became a model for other women who aspired to attain similar status. Their role as trendsetters in the realms of fashion and beauty cannot be understated. Even today, the 18th century courtesan continues to serve as a symbol of beauty and style, influencing everything from historical films to fashion trends. Yet, the courtesan's legacy is also one of tragedy and loss. Their fleeting beauty, their dependence on the whims of powerful men, and their eventual fall from grace make their stories poignant reminders of the fragility of fame. Few courtesans managed to escape the inevitable decay of time, and even fewer were able to secure a lasting legacy independent of their romantic entanglements. Some ended their days in relative obscurity, while others faced financial ruin, rejected by the very courts and men who had once adored them. The most tragic of these stories often involves the courtesan's inability to secure her place in society once her beauty had faded, an inevitability that was almost as cruel as it was predictable. Despite the hardships many courtesans faced in the latter years of their lives, we must also acknowledge the ways in which they redefined the roles of women in a patriarchal society. The courtesan was both an object of desire and a figure of power, a woman who could command attention and wield influence with little more than her presence. While their power was often short-lived, it was undeniable. For a brief moment in history, the courtesan was able to transcend the traditional limitations placed on women and become a figure of both beauty and influence, reshaping the way society viewed women in public life. Historians still argue whether the courtesan should be remembered as a symbol of women's power or as a tragic reminder of the constraints of beauty. Should we celebrate their intellectual and cultural contributions, or should we mourn their inevitable decline? Perhaps the true legacy of the courtesan lies in the complexity of their lives. Women who navigated a world of contradictory expectations, constantly balancing between the roles of lover, muse, intellectual, and influencer. As we close this chapter, it's important to reflect on the nature of their legacy. While the courtesan's life was defined by the pursuit of beauty, it was also marked by a quiet resilience. They were able to survive in a world that often discarded them when their beauty faded, and they were able to adapt to a constantly shifting social landscape. Their ability to reinvent themselves, to remain relevant, and to wield influence in an often unforgiving world speaks to their strength and ingenuity. And so, as the final pages of their story are written, we find that the courtesan's legacy is one that resists easy categorization. She is both a symbol of beauty and power, and a reminder of the transitory nature of fame and influence. The courtesan's story is not one of mere scandal or fleeting romance. It is a tale of navigating the complexities of love, politics, and survival in a world that often viewed women as little more than ornamental accessories to men's power. Now, as you drift off into the night, think of the courtesans not just as figures of intrigue, but as women who, for a time, wielded influence in a world that was not kind to those who were not born into it. And perhaps, in their resilience, we can see echoes of the strength that all women possess when they navigate a world that demands so much from them.